speaker is George Logush, president of Kyiv School of Economics. Mr. Logush's considerable academic experience in the Ukraine and the US is complemented by his extensive business experience. He has served as managing director for Kraft's Food in Eastern Europe and Ukraine division. And under his leadership, Kraft Food was recognized as best employer in Ukraine for many years. Mr. Logush, please welcome.
I have a presentation, so I'm going to try to marry academic style and practice. Let me tell you that I speak, in fact, from these both foundations. I came to Ukraine in 1989 to help set up an MBA program, which is still functioning. I started working in Ukraine full-time in 1992, setting up RJ Reynolds Tobacco, then KPMG, and then Kraft Foods, where I stayed for 16 years. Built it from a small company of $4 million in revenue to $800 million in revenue as a hub for 12 countries of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. And with the highest, I can say, margins for our businesses in Central and Eastern Europe. So this is a practice that I'd like to convey to you in this survey of a rather broad theme of reforms and economic outlook. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. I have less than 10 minutes. I think you'll see some stuff on the slides, and I'll ad-lib as we go along. If I can just get this to work. Here we go. Good. Here's an unusual map. People think Ukraine is big. Yeah. It's like from Boston to Chicago, and from, I don't know, Canada down to Washington, D.C. Pretty big. It is the fifth largest by population, the largest by area. Largest by area? Yeah. Thanks. Now I have two microphones. Great. Can you hear me? Hello? Yes. Okay. The largest by area. In 1989, it was the 12th largest economy in the world, believe it or not. And then deep depression over 5 years lost 70% of GDP. So Ukrainians became accustomed to shocks. They're very hardy people. And what's happening now is difficult, but not as bad as it used to be in many respects. By 2008, it was the second largest GDP on the purchasing power basis in Central and Eastern Europe, ninth largest in Europe, with a GDP per capita of 7,800. Guess what? In 2015, it's about the same. So you can see that those years were not very productive, and Ukraine is basically at a starting point. Its economy is very balanced. It is the breadbasket of Europe. It has light and heavy industry, metallurgy, chemistry, mineral extraction, aerospace, you name it, it's there. So the potential for investors is enormous. And it has the most arable land in Europe, could feed 1 billion people. Reforms, we talk about reforms, you have to remember that reforms were a lot, we've had reforms all along. It's not that we're starting from a Soviet base. But reforms at the very beginning were blocked by communists and socialists. Let's face it, Ukraine had a big problem with what was basically a fifth column for Russia, which kept diverting it. They muddled along until the economy collapsed. The population began to shrink. If you talk about shock therapy, that is shock therapy. And so Ukraine chose the lesser evil. It simply gifted huge businesses to oligarchs who managed to get them going, oriented them on the old connections to Russia, leading to curtailment of democracy, leveraging industrial regions against of Donbass against reform, which later exploded into the revolution of 2013. And we paid the wages of sin. Let's face it, total corruption and plunder, there's no other word but to say, plunder of the state treasury, dictatorship, alliance with Russia, it's back to Europe and economic collapse. That's the story of reform until 2013. As a result, if you compare Ukraine and Poland, and that's a comparison that's very frequently made, you can see the red line is Poland GDP growth, and the blue line is Ukraine's GDP growth. That gap is also a sign of potential, because in many respects, Ukraine is not only comparable to Poland, but exceeds in its capabilities and in its resources what is available in Poland. The Great Transformation, we understand, started in November of 2013. Notice that that invasion by Russia, which started in Crimea, was prepared well in advance. Didn't happen spontaneously, as was admitted later. So Russia knew if Ukraine faced Europe, it would try to take Ukraine. A very ominous warning to all of us. Norway also has a common border with Russia. What's different about reforms this time, of course, is that there's a huge support of business and civil society, which didn't exist before in the driver reform. Now, Ukraine has a triple challenge at this point, and it's important not to underestimate the complexity, and that explains a lot. It explains a lot of achievement and explains, to some degree, even perhaps some slower progress than expected. Number one, an invasion and a so-called asymmetric war. Yeah, but the important thing here is that that seems to be quieting down. Putin has found a new place to play games, and he's sort of moving his marbles bit by bit into a different location. We're talking about the Middle East. But there's continued occupation of Crimea and part of Donbass. What does that mean? In terms of loss of economy, it's 15% of the GDP that's tied up in that region. That's either lost or impaired. Loss of export is about 20% of GDP. Loss of territory, 5% was mentioned, and population, 6 million people are affected by that war. It's a densely populated part of Ukraine. The sad part also is that it's a part which has a very aged infrastructure and has businesses which rely very largely on subsidies and privilege status, which is gone. And so all those billionaires suddenly find that their net worth is cut in half, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a curse, and to some degree, it also, for the future, means a lighter burden for Ukraine. Internally displaced person, 1.5 million, and of course, enormous losses because of the war to infrastructure, military expenditures, and so on. Tied in with that, and the imminent collapse that existed of the economy under Yanukovych, Ukraine also went into deep economic contraction. Not a 70% drop in GDP, 70%, but a significant one nevertheless, 15%, which is about equal to the loss of the GDP from occupied territories. So that says something. It says that the base for growth is there. If your GDP drops by exactly the amount of GDP that's taken away, then the rest must be relatively stable. And if you travel to cities like Kyiv and Lviv and Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkiv and so on, it's hard to believe there's a war going on. Cafes, restaurants are bustling, streets are crowded with expensive automobiles, people are at work and so on, which is a very encouraging sign for investors. Just think for a moment, a country at war, and you travel around the country and you can't see that there's a war going on. Other effects, devaluation, 8 hryvnia to $1 to 24. Huge problem, huge opportunity. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Inflation up to 50%, a bulge, which is subsiding now. And budget issues, you can imagine the huge budget strains, but yet the budget is being brought into control, the deficit is being contained, and a good foundation is being built. What does that mean for investors? Well, first of all of us as investors know, buy low, sell high. This is a chance to buy low. Of course, there's always a risk attached to it, you know. So you have to evaluate the risk. But the risk attached to Ukraine, I would argue, is the same as the risk attached to Norway. If Ukraine goes, Norway's at risk. So if you're going to invest in Ukraine. If you're not going to invest, then you're ready probably for something even worse than what's happened so far. A highly qualified workforce, less costly than in China. Are you joking? Is something that is possible? Where is it? It's in Ukraine. Hurry up. And finally, DCFTA, enormous synergies. This is a pony to ride on. And then reform. On top of all this, you have to do reform. I won't mention the fact that reform often means hardships to the population, especially reforms in the energy sector and so on. But let's take a look at some other aspects of it. First of all, there's a change in the worldview. Ukrainians no longer see themselves as a vassal state. They see themselves as Europeans. Secondly, the drivers of reform are twofold. Government, which is executive, plus the government, plus the legislature, in cooperation. But I must say this is a democracy. So if you see disagreements and quarrels and so on, well, it's a democracy. I have 1 minute left. And secondly, what keeps the pressure? It's civil society and business. I don't think civil society is going to go to sleep as it did after 2004. I think it's going to be working hard, and business is tight in. Anti-corruption reform, list of items. That's very important. Corruption's in gray, has to be dealt with. A new political culture, elections, including local, which just took place, and again on the 15th. Second round, decentralization, which is new, and constitutional reform. Government state reforms, just take a look. Rebalancing, lustration. Okay, this is something like, you know, the Nuremberg process after World War II. Yeah. Judicial reform, big pain in the neck, very difficult to handle. The Europeans are involved, sometimes messing up the process of reform for Ukraine. Law enforcement, civil service. A minister earns $500 a month, and you want him to be free of corruption. Do you understand the problem? Civil service reform is a must. State-owned enterprises, transform and privatized, e-governance and e-government. Okay. Procurement reform, there's a business ombudsman for the first time. Yeah. And then in business, we're talking about macroeconomic stabilization, external debt restructuring, massive support by these international agencies, which is good news for investors. Yeah, it's a good signal. And then sectoral reforms in energy, in agriculture, in banking, and so many others as well. And then horizontal reforms on top of that. Deregulation and regulations in conformity with the EU, all at the same time, complex task. Abolitions of licenses for export, tax reform, etc. That's a big plate, isn't it, for a country at war? So, what is the outlook and the opportunities? That gap between Poland and Ukraine, that's a measure of opportunity. Yeah, the DCFTA, we know what that means. This is no joking, but the Ukrainians cannot do that without European help. So your investments can actually pay off because you can then enter them into that flood of exports into Europe. And Ukrainians have to upgrade their standards. Great investment opportunities. Brownfields, for a little bit of money, you upgrade the standards, and wow, you're going. A few things just to keep in mind. China in Ukraine, think about that. Okay, that speaks for itself. From breadbasket to food basket. Okay, let's think of that. What that means in terms of investment opportunities into value-added and export industries. And then new technologies from food basket to brain basket. Okay, another area of focus. Energy from dependence to independence. All of these are investment opportunities. And then infrastructure modernization, roads, ports, rail, etc. That's the forecast, World Bank. This is the turnaround year. Let's see. And finally, you're not alone. Lots of international companies from the very beginning, from 1992. International organizations are in a big way, many, many billions of dollars. And business associations, beginning with the EBA, which is the best, of course, and finally, ombudsman, embassies, and so on. Thank you. I would like just one more moment to give word to Vladimir, just 1 minute, because he wants to talk about the Brain Basket Foundation. This is not a commercial pitch. This is a way of building the infrastructure. Hurry up, Vladimir, before they lock the door here. But he needs a little bit of help. I chair this foundation. He's the executive officer. Here you go.
Thank you very much, and thank George. And don't worry, just 1 minute. So I'm not going to break your agenda. Sorry. My name is Vladimir Lulka. I'm executive director of Brain Basket Foundation. I'm Ukrainian, and I'm proud. So what we are doing? So we are NGO, so a non-commercial organization. Established more than 1 year ago. So let's look about some few facts about Ukraine, IT industry in Ukraine. So we are already in top 3 Europe by market talent pool. So we are attracting more than $2 billion in Ukraine. It's about IT industry now. And we have we have good army of IT specialists now. So, and what we are going to do, where is, just a moment. The main idea of our foundations, which by the way was founded by a Scandinavian guy, it's Torben Meiger, CEO and founder of Cyclum. It's top 5 outsourcing company in Eastern Europe. And George Logush, where's George? Is chairman of our supervisory board. Thank you one more time. and me, it's a person who are executive director. So what we are doing now, we're going to do. We wanna retrain 100,000 people, Ukrainian people, and gives them a chance to be IT specialists. And I think it's a unique chance for Ukraine because we are already a strong IT country, but let's be more stronger. Let's make Europe more stronger. Why US? Let's do in Europe. And what we are doing now, the biggest and main project for just a moment. So we decided to start a unique experiment on the nation, and train 100,000 people starting from 1st of December. So Harvard University, you know everybody, it's a very good institute. So we decided to train people by Harvard CS50, Computer Science 50 course. And during next 2 years, we prepare, again, 100,000 people. It's not a joke. So what we wanna ask you, what I'm asking you, is just support Ukraine. Thank you very much.